Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And today I'm going to be making a sprite style swap, taking two video game sprites and imagining them in the rendering style of the other. For this swap we've got Ryu Hayabusa from Ninja Gaiden for the NES, and X in his sprite style for Mega Man X4 through X6. I chose these two because, while they're both side-scroller sprites, their vastly different styles should lead to a pretty dramatic swapped result. I'm going to start with the likely easier of the two, making X in the style of the NES Ninja Gaiden. When I look at the original sprite, what stands out to me the most is the way the dark line work segments most of the costume design. This works particularly well for X because of all the paneling and armor pieces, so the early part of my design here is focused on building up the line work of those shapes. I'm using an 8x8 grid here to help me plan out the sizing, since that's the tile size used to make sprites on the NES. One of the things that threw me off was how the change of style affected the proportions of the character. X is kind of anime-esque, while Ryu is sort of, even though he's a smaller sprite, the proportions and the head-to-body ratio are a little bit more realistic. So seeing X all of a sudden kind of look like a man was weird at first, but I slowly worked up the sizing and bulk to find something that looked like it fit proportionally with Ryu. To color the sprite, I'm using the NES palette, of course, and I've limited the bulk of the sprite to only 3 colors, following that 3-color restriction for NES sprites. However, the apparent color count of NES sprites could be pushed higher using a technique of stacking multiple tiles on one location, such as how Ryu's attack sprite uses 2 additional colors for the sword, or like how the original Mega Man sprite was a total of 5 colors. So with the X sprite, I've added 2 additional colors, one for the face and one for the red accent on the helmet. And I made sure to fit both of those within a single 8x8 tile of the grid, just to theoretically minimize tile stacking. My other inclination was to use the midtone blue as a shade color for the teal sections, but the styling of the Ryu sprite doesn't really have too many spots where the pink and purple are used together in this way. So I ended up kind of scaling back on that kind of rendering to something that was just more segmented and flat. And in the end, I think it reads closer to the style that it's trying to emulate. Overall, I think it does a good job balancing character recognizability with the proportioning of Ninja Gaiden, and kind of feels like it'd work for a style of game that could actually use those more detailed North American Mega Man box art covers, where he actually kind of looks like a man. Either way, let's flip it to the reverse and work it in the other direction now with an X4 styled Ryu sprite. To get started, I blocked out a space of 48 by 48 pixels, and you can see with the grid how that scales with the sprites from X4. I'm using circles to place down the main points of articulation, and then I'm joining those up to form a rough character silhouette for now. The pose that I'm trying to make here is modeled after that found on the cover for Ninja Gaiden. I think there's a great interplay of angles there with the weapons, and this artwork also gives us some indication of how the character should look with the higher detail that we'll be able to achieve in the X4 style. From here, I'm erasing from that silhouette to find some foundational line work for this sprite. While the X4 style doesn't use dark line work segmentation everywhere, like what we saw with the Ninja Gaiden style, you can still see traces of this idea in how the darker shades provide a sort of colored line work to achieve a similar segmenting in the costume. We can think of the line work for now representing the places where the deepest shadow tones will be, and they'll provide an anchoring edge from which we can step toward lighter tones when doing the shading work. So with that in mind, the first phase here is just to get a clear and readable line work sprite in place that'll provide that foundation. One of the major issues I ran into with this one was just with the overall direction that I chose for how he's facing. With the chest facing to the right and the arm holding the katana coming toward us, I found it difficult to place it in a way that maintained a clear read on it while also looking cool and dynamic like in that reference art. To be correct at this angle, I think the majority of that katana would end up being covered by his body entirely, so it's not exactly the best orientation for this pose. So I ended up doing a bit of sprite surgery, and I just flipped the torso and legs to the mirror image, which then allows the katana arm to be tucked back further, thereby enabling more of it to show up on the other side of the sprite compared to that original orientation. Obviously there are some side effects to this kind of manipulation, like some other corrections required for the arms and legs, but overall I really like the way this new pose came together after that. In the final stage of the line work, I've also added in the scabbard, and now we've got that really cool and dynamic directionality to everything here, just like in that reference artwork. In order to color the sprite, we need to break down the colors of the X4 style. And what's really important here isn't the colors themselves, it's the color value. When viewing the sprites in grayscale, we can get a feel for how strong adjacent steps of color are to one another, as well as just the overall distribution of contrast among the sprite. To get this started on Ryu, I began by filling in some flat grays first, just to make some broad decisions about contrast, like how his tunic will be darker than his skin, how the cuffs will be darker than the tunic, things like that. From here, I'm going through and applying those steps of grayscale shading to everything, which is what the bulk of the rendering can be considered to be. What's interesting to note is how the grayscale contrast of X varies quite differently from that of Zero. Notice how the tones in X's sprite are more closely related groups of gray tones, kind of a little bit softer, while Zero has a wider dynamic range of tone, reaching from bright whites all the way to darker blacks than X, kind of a higher contrast overall. Because the primary comparison for this swap is the X sprite, I'm leaning more to that moderate contrast look, and I think that pairs well for Ryu since his tunic should be more dull than either of these shiny metal boys anyway. In the end, I've used about 4 shades of gray for each section of costume, such as that used to create subtle folds in the fabric by stepping through the full gradient one shade at a time. Finally, to actually add color, I'm overlaying the purple from the NES sprite by filling it in on a new layer and setting it to the color blending mode. This will imbue the sprite with that color while preserving the value contrast from the grayscale layer underneath. Similarly, I go through and paint in each section of sprite in a color approximating the desired hue, and since it's all on that blending mode layer, it'll just blend together using my existing contrast. Now, this obviously still looks pretty flat, and that's because the steps of color within each color group of the sprite are all still the same hue. They're simply just lighter or darker versions of that same color. To really pull this together, the last step is to go through and shift the hues around to create a warm to cool color temperature when going from light to dark tones. So I know that watching someone make subtle tweaks to adjustment layers isn't exactly the most compelling kind of footage, but essentially what's going on here is that I'm shifting the dark purples into more of a blue, while shifting the light purples toward pink. Another good example of this is shifting the shadow tones of the skin into red while having the lighter tones toward yellow. And you get that kind of natural warmth and color depth to it that wasn't there before. And this was all done using the same trick with the color blending mode in order to maintain the value contrast throughout these tweaks. One of the final tweaks with the coloring here was making the boots and the scarf into more of a blue, just to have them stand out as a different material against the purple tunic. By the way, I know the original sprite looks to have bare feet, but in sort of the promo artwork it tends to use this full foot covering. And I thought that was a cooler look for this styling, so that's what I went with. Bringing everything together now, we can take a full look at the style swap results. Overall, I think they actually turned out to be fairly passable approximations of each respective style. And either way, it was fun to kind of reverse engineer a little bit about what goes into each. It's the kind of exercise that really shows you how pixel art isn't just a singular style on its own. There's all sorts of variations within that, depending how you approach the rendering and the restrictions. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know in the comments if you've got other swap ideas, and thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.